Well, the Ministry of Health has just published its review of puberty blockers. Puberty blockers are used as part of the process to direct young people who are gender confused towards starting the process of trying to change their sex. But here's a key thing to understand. Puberty blockers don't pause, they predict. The overwhelming number of children on puberty blockers will go on to wrong sex hormones. Puberty blockers are used to delay the changes of puberty, and when taken regularly, they stop the body from making sex hormones. So testosterone for boys, estrogen for girls. So for boys, they slow the growth of facial and body hair, prevent voice deepening, and limit the growth of the penis, scrotum, and testicles. For girls, the treatment stops breast development or limits it and stops menstruation. Sounds problematic, doesn't it? Whenever you interfere with the natural process, and especially puberty, there's always going to be issues. But the Ministry of Health have published their review and it admits there's a lack of good quality evidence for the effectiveness or safety of puberty blocking treatment. So, have they immediately halted the giving out of puberty blockers as you would expect them to? No. But when you know who was on the review panel, it probably won't surprise you. So New Zealand has been prescribing puberty blockers at a rate 10 times higher per head of population than the UK, where puberty blockers have just been stopped because of what's known as a 4-year-long CAS review, which concluded, amongst other things, puberty blockers should no longer be prescribed to children except in the context of research due to the powerful drug's effects on brain development and bone health. Cross-sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone should be prescribed to trans-identifying 16 and 17-year-olds only with extreme caution, and there should be a clear clinical rationale for not waiting until the teen is 18 with a bit more understanding of what's actually happening to their body. Now, the CAS report also destroys the suicide trope, the better a live son than a dead daughter, which is used to manipulate parents. And it said, young people facing gender-related distress had no significantly different levels of suicide risk to other young people with similar levels of complex presentations. And there's no evidence that gender-affirming treatment reduces suicide risk. Now, remember all these facts as we review what the Ministry of Health said yesterday. The Ministry of Health was in the middle of reviewing the evidence last year, and as part of the process they were updating the guidelines, and the report was supposed to come out last December. Then it was March or April of this year, then it was August, and we're now in November. But the CAS report in April mucked all that up, didn't it? The Ministry knew it was coming. I suspect the Ministry were going to give the green light to continue abusing our children with the message that puberty blockers are safe, reversible and all good. But they've had to change it from a green light to, unfortunately, orange. Now, why is that? Why haven't they just gone red light? Well, here's the problem. Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand, contracted a group to write up the guidelines, and they contracted none other than PATHA to write the original guidelines. PATHA, the Professional Association of Transgender Health Aotearoa, there's nothing professional about them as a group of trans activists. They supported so-called conversion therapy bans, but they want to practice conversion therapy on your kids. Ironic, isn't it? Virtually all the leadership team and advisory board are transgender and are closely affiliated with the massively discredited WPATH, the world body. But who's reviewing the evidence? Well, Speak Up for Women did an OIA to the Ministry of Health to find out, and here's the response. The evidence brief examining the safety and long-term impacts of puberty blockers will be released shortly, and it was peer-reviewed by Professor Paul Hoffman of the Liggins Institute, University of Auckland, and Dame Sue Bagshaw from Christchurch. Now, I hadn't heard of Professor Paul Hoffman before this, but a quick bit of research confirmed my concerns. He helped set up the guidelines 15 years ago, and in 2013, so 11 years ago, he said in the article, it says, Hoffman said he was a cautious supporter of intervention through puberty blockers once a youth has been diagnosed by one or more psychiatrists and counselling support. Quote, this is a vulnerable group of children and adolescents. It's a psychiatric condition, not medical. End quote. Okay, well, if it's psychiatric, why would you chemicalise and use puberty blockers? I mean, that's like using weight loss pills for anorexia. Now, after the Cass report came out in early April, Professor Hoffman told News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking that the blockers reduce self-harm and suicidal ideation in some patients, but there hasn't been any strong follow-up studies looking at quality of life and the impacts, nor any issues around safety. But a major red flag, he says puberty blockers are all reversible, and safety is a bit of a beat-up. Now have a listen, and by the way, he mentions precocious puberty. It's a completely different issue, relating to when puberty begins too early for a child who's going through it. Puberty blockers, however, blocks the natural process at the right when a child should be going through puberty.
Of 50 studies, only one was of high quality, the others criticised for various flaws. Explain to me as a layman, how is it possible the medical profession goes down a path with no evidence?
Well, it's unfortunately not just a situation. It happens in many situations where people feel that the information that's present justifies a treatment. I think there's two components to this treatment, or two main components from a medical perspective. One is blocking puberty until the children are of an age to make their own decisions, which is around 16 generally in New Zealand, or Gaelic competence. And then there's the use of, and that's all reversible.
And that's controversial, though, isn't it? I mean, 16's points out, 18, your brain's still developing in your 20s.
Yeah, that's true. But if you look at a whole range of situations, so we use puberty blockers in many thousands of children for precocious puberty, and that's something I have been involved in. There is no evidence that there's any issues there in both physical and mental health, although, again, the data is not super great, but the data out there would suggest there's no difference. There's also situations where people go into puberty after 16, 17, and they have no long-term problems either. Right. So I think the data around safety is a bit of a beat-up myself. But I do think very clearly that there is an issue with efficacy, is what are we doing, and are we doing something that's effective? And I have to say the other point to that is if you're treating with testosterone in a girl or estrogen in a boy after the age of 16, that certainly may have impact, permanent impact, and we know that. And so that becomes more of an issue to me rather than the blockers themselves.
I'm almost dealing with them.
Okay, let's leave that. You know, it expresses some concerns, although using the suicide trope is a major concern. But here's the key thing. When the briefing paper was released yesterday, the media all rushed to two people, or Radio New Zealand and New Zealand Herald. They went to Professor Hoffman, and the other one was Dr. Massimo Giola, a sexual health physician who provides gender care. That sounds independent and credible. Radio New Zealand, New Zealand Herald did it. Stuff were too scared to ask experts in case it disagreed with their stated policy narrative of supporting trans at all cost. No dissent allowed. Did any of the media ask for comment from a doctor who opposes puberty blockers as flawed and dangerous? Did they ring Hilary Cass, Dr. Hilary Cass in the UK? Don't be silly. News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking spoke to Professor Hoffman this morning. Listen to what he says about puberty blockers. It won't instill any confidence in this issue. He says very safe, reversible drug, but in terms of efficacy, the evidence is very poor.
I think if you look at the wider safety, looking at all the kids, of which there are hundreds of thousands over the last 30 years been on this drug, it is a very safe, reversible drug. But in terms of its efficacy, the data is poor, and that just reflects doctors not assuming that it's going to work without actually following up and making sure it does.
Okay, but then he does go on to make actually some very legitimate points.
And what are the odds of, I mean, how much variation is there? Because presumably you started on the journey of this with a GP. Is there variation all over the place?
Yeah. We've had a rights-based approach in New Zealand as opposed to a more evidence-based approach for some time. In other words, it's a person, if they feel trans, it's their right to have this medication, as opposed to it being evidence-based, justifiable, done in a multidisciplinary team where there's mental health support and other issues, another expertise. And so I think we are going down what most of the rest of the world are doing, is going down to a more conservative, evidence-based approach with a wraparound care for these very vulnerable kids.
Yeah, that does sound a lot better, doesn't it? Wrap around, deal with the mental health issues. But here's the other key problem. The other reviewer is Dame Sue Bagshaw. and that should make us all very concerned. She's been the go-to person for the media on this issue because she's one of the few medical professionals pushing the narrative they want. Let me show you the evidence. Starting in 2015, a transition with a never-ending cost, the article said, for trans youth. Finding support is hard and getting funding for surgery is even harder. And she talks glowingly about the surgery involving cutting into the boy's chest, the girl's chest actually, and removing the breast tissue. His nipples were cut off, resized and then stitched back into place, or her nipples were cut off. I mean, do you want this type of doctor reviewing treatment for your vulnerable child? The article continues that Dr. Bagshaw says she believes the cost is one of the main things preventing trans youth from having surgery, and she believes surgeries such as mastectomies and hysterectomies can make a huge difference to people's lives and should be cheaper. She also explains that suicide, anxiety, social phobias and depression are among the effects of trans youth not getting the support they need. Yeah, it's got nothing to do with the medical professionals and school deans not dealing with the presenting psychiatric issues. In 2021, she featured again, and it was around controversy brewing over transgender children's access to puberty blockers. The critics were saying the medical profession is far too ready to offer puberty blockers, and they dispute the Ministry of Health's claims they're safe and reversible. But one expert who works with transgender children, guess who our expert is in New Zealand? Dame Sue Bagshaw says the drugs are lifesavers.
Whenever anything's social, it's also political. And that's what I put that down to, is very much some ideology conflicting with what we're trying to do to help these young people.
Dame Sue Bagshaw has treated scores of children with gender dysphoria, and while these drugs are the same ones used to chemically castrate male sex offenders in other countries, she's not concerned.
I don't have too much problem because they are reversible. And that's the main message I'd love you to get across, is that these drugs are reversible.
No, they're not.
US paediatrician Julia Mason has a different view.
They're very powerful medicine. They act in the brainstem to stop all of the sex-related hormones.
She worries that confused children are going down rabbit holes online and making rash decisions about their gender.
And start to see that, this is the explanation for everything. If I do this, it will solve all my problems. And they can really become very convinced very quickly if they spend some time online.
Yep, but Sue Bagshaw seems convinced that blockers are reversible. But the literature review she had a student perform over the summer previously found potential impacts on brain maturation. In fact, in 2022, Otago University removed claims by Dame Sue Bagshaw in regards to bone density recovery after puberty blockers from its website due to inaccuracies. But here she is again.
This Christchurch doctor has been helping transgender youth pause puberty since 2004.
What the blockers do is give you space to explore that. And that's the important bit. And buying that time is really important because they're reversible.
The study collated research on puberty blockers from the last decade. It showed a really positive impact on mental health, but there's a lack of information on any long-term physical effects.
We need to help those who are in this situation so that their mental health can flourish and be who they are.
And then in September 2022, puberty blockers used jumps as experts back results. Dame Sue Bagshaw, the article says, has many transgender patients at her Christchurch youth practice, but she conceded there were some unknowns about the long-term effects of puberty blockers, particularly on bone density. Yeah. But she says, however, the same could be said of many drugs, and that was not a reason to stop prescribing them. So Bagshaw pushes the suicide trope and the safety of puberty blockers. Can I just remind you what the Cass review said, and also the recent research out of Finland which backed this up, that puberty blockers is dangerous and it has effects on brain development and bone health, and young people facing gender-related distress have had no significantly different levels of suicide risk to other young people with similar levels of complex presentations, and no evidence that gender-affirming treatment reduces the suicide risk. Now, the recent Finnish study found that the suicide risk in a large group of adolescents was predicted by the psychiatric problems that often accompany gender distress, not by the gender distress itself. The Radio New Zealand article goes on, if you're going to say, let's not use puberty blockers, we're going to have to redouble our efforts to ensure the mental health of transgender diverse young people is looked after, Sue Bagshaw said. Offering psychosocial support as first-line treatment for gender dysphoria in young people was challenging. Well, focus on mental health, healing the mind rather than cutting the body. That's actually a great idea, Sue. I mean, how does she deal with anorexia nervosa or suicidal ideation? I mean, too challenging to offer mental health support? And then even after the Cass review was released, she was still the go-to for media, this time Radio New Zealand.
Ministry last year removed the claim from its website that puberty blockers are safe and reversible. Leading youth health specialist Dame Sue Bagshaw insists they are both. She says most patients on blockers do progress to cross-sex hormones.
Because most kids know what they want. Most kids know who they are, and that's confirmed with time. And so they do carry on with the hormones. It's that smarter pathway which they've already chosen by saying they have gender dysphoria.
Dame Sue says each patient must be treated as an individual.
It's almost become a moral panic.
Panic.
Oh dear, this gender issue, this is getting out of hand. We must do something. It's still only within 2%.
Yeah, she says kids know what they want. It's almost a moral panic, only 2%. Kids would know what they want. What child going through puberty or pre-puberty knows what they want for their childhood? But this is the person who is reviewing the evidence brief for the Ministry of Health on puberty blockers. Now, the other major hurdle in getting some common sense and protection for children is, of course, the mainstream media. They're always keen to push back on the research with some local anecdotal stories. For example, in April, 5 independent mainstream media outlets, Radio New Zealand, News Hub, One News, New Zealand Herald and News Talk ZB, reprinted the exact same story. Criticism of puberty blockers misguided, trans girl's mother says. Yeah, apparently they're all independent media. But let's just have a look at what the Radio New Zealand article said. The mother of a transgender teenager says having her child come out at the age of 8 let her and her family take a deep collective breath. However, as far as their daughter was concerned, they accepted it immediately. As soon as she told us who she was, then we just went with that. 8 years old, coming out, knowing as a biological boy that he was a girl. Really? At that stage, there was no need for medical interventions, but within a couple of years, puberty was looming, the article says. And at that point, she let us know very clearly that she did not want the changes that would come to her unless she was given something to give her support. Now, remember, we're referring to a young boy. So the young boy was fearful of puberty. Well, it's a human experience that every one of us goes through, the natural process. But because of a flawed ideology, this young boy is scared of it. Now, in fairness to Radio New Zealand, there is some discussion on the Cass report and how puberty blockers virtually always lead to cross-sex hormones. That's not what Dame Sue Bagshaw said, by the way. And that there's concern about the harms of puberty blockers. But the article admits, quote, nearly all children on blockers subsequently progress to a medical transition using cross-sex hormones. Yep, correct. Remember what I said earlier? Puberty blockers don't pause, they predict. The overwhelming number of children on puberty blockers will go on to wrong-sex hormones. But here's what one of the lead New Zealand doctors in this whole radical experiment says. Now, this is from Paddy Gower's Paddy's Got Issues, when they talked about the issues of puberty blockers. This is from the middle of last year, and it was after the Ministry of Health quietly removed the statement about puberty blockers being safe and reversible, even though Dame Sue Bagshaw still says they are safe and reversible, and even though our Professor Hoffman still says they're safe and reversible. But the Ministry of Health removed that statement, and we were watching and called them out on it. Now, have a watch and note that the doctor being interviewed is a member of none other than the radical activist group PATHA, which is associated with WPATH.
Puberty blockers are a medication that are used to just pause puberty. They can't turn it backwards, so they can't reverse changes that have already happened, but absolutely they can just pause things. So this, if you imagine if physical changes that are causing distress are occurring, by stopping those can be incredibly beneficial, on a physical level and on a psychological level. But if you were to stop those puberty blockers, puberty would just kick in again.
Auckland paediatrician Dr. Rachel Johnson is currently seeing a variety of patients, from young children to people in their 20s.
Over 10 years of following young people who are on blockers, I do think that accessing puberty blockers in the context of the way that young people can in New Zealand is really appropriate. They're not some universal treatment for every trans youth. A youth, that's always a really carefully considered decision whether, the benefits outweigh any potential risks.
Are they safe and reversible?
No.
I would absolutely say in the years of experience of using blockers and based on the worldwide evidence that they are a safe and reversible medication.
Just refuses to acknowledge the science, deep into the ideology. They'll have a lot to answer for, won't they? The media don't want you to know about people like Chloe Cole, who spoke at our conference, detransitioners who just understand that they didn't know what they were doing at the time that they were going through all this chemicalisation and castration. I'm not too sure they're too keen on reporting about this latest edict from the Ministry of Health. And of course, they only rushed to get comment from supporters of prescribing puberty blockers. By the way, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, in 2022 put out a warning label about the risks of puberty blockers. So just finally, what did the Ministry of Health review find? What did they release yesterday? Well, read the summary. This is quite damning. The evidence review found a lack of good quality evidence for the effectiveness or safety of puberty blocking treatment in young people with gender dysphoria. We do not have good evidence to say that the medicines used improve the longer term outcomes for young people with gender related health needs, nor that the potential longer term risks are low. Wow, that is damning. That should be the end of it. When would you prescribe something to a child that lacks good quality evidence and has no evidence that it improves outcomes or how bad the risks are? Yeah, you wouldn't. And any parent who has a doctor who wants to prescribe puberty blockers for their child should be shouting, hell no. But the ministry doesn't quite have that intellectual prowess, and I suspect is really struggling with making even this admission that it made. So they want more advice and input. They're considering whether further measures need to be put in place to ensure no children or young people are unduly exposed to unknown risks. Well, they already are. And so they are thinking about updating clinical guidelines. For example, they might actually put a regulation under the Medicines Act so that actually we have some formal prescribing. We know how many kids are being prescribed it. It's all a bit Wild West at the moment. And so they say that they wish to take into account all information and views before any decisions are made, and they seek input from organisations. Yeah, not interested in you pesky parents. No, just organisations, and preferably ones that support gender ideology, that represent people who may be affected by safety measures. Parents, you represent people affected by the safety measures, so you speak up on this. And they've got a series of questions: whether additional safety measures are needed, yes. Whether prescribing should be further restricted, yes. Which young people with gender-related health needs should be able to receive this treatment, None. Give them counselling. And what impacts there could be from additional safety measures? Well, only good impacts. Now, there's also a position statement accompanying the evidence brief, and it talks about the findings. The full evidence brief and addendum are available on the Ministry of Health website. And it has this summary that there is some evidence that people treated with puberty blockers, bone density appears to increase at less than the expected rate. Actually, the CAS review put that beyond doubt, said there was major concern. It says about organ systems are often impacted, but for those on puberty blockers, there's currently no evidence of impact. And they include fertility there. I mean, just ask Chloe Cole whether it has affected her fertility. And while there are some studies that suggest an improvement in depression, anxiety and suicidal ideation for individuals treated with puberty blockers, the quality of the evidence is poor. Actually, it's not poor. Read the Finnish study. I mean, that statement's just ridiculous. Overall, the evidence brief found significant limitations in the quality of evidence for the benefits or risks or lack thereof of the use of puberty blockers, insufficient basis to say that puberty blockers are safe or reversible as an intervention. So they're trying to have a bit of both ways. But basically, they're admitting they just can't stand behind it 100%. And then they say to medical professionals, this is interesting, clinicians, just started the second paragraph, clinicians who initiate puberty blockers should be experienced in providing gender-affirming care, be part of an interprofessional team. Well, those are the ones that worry me because it suggests that they've been truly sucked into the ideology. They need to consider the possible presence of other associated conditions. No kidding. Young people who experience gender incongruence experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. Now, the question they're not asking here is it part and parcel of the comorbidity disorders? The argument is always, you've got to let them go through changing their sex or else they will be anxious, depressed, and have suicidal ideation. But in fact, that mental illness is already present. It goes on, they should have timely access to therapeutic supports which meet their mental health needs. Quite right. The use of puberty blockers in gender-affirming care remains a relatively new area of medicine. Well, in fact, it's a cowboy area of medicine and it's the Wild West. So, look, they want to press caution, but they want to continue to assess the emerging evidence and will provide updates to the position statement as necessary. And children can still have puberty blockers. It's a little bit like saying, a friend said this to me actually, it's a bit like saying, well, I'm going to use this medication until there is proof that it doesn't work. But at least I'm doing something about the problem rather than nothing, and that makes us all feel better. Yeah, it's what some call pathological compassion. Actually healing the mind rather than chemicalizing, cutting and confusing the body is a far better option. It's the option that the adults in the room would choose. It's the option that parents would choose if they had all the facts. But look, we've pushed them this far. Don't stop. The ship is turning. We can see that. This affects every young person who is struggling with their identity and may believe they're the opposite sex. We should have absolute confidence that children will be protected from a flawed and destructive ideology that has harmed so many young people already. It's up to you and I to call it out, even if the Ministry of Health doesn't want to hear it.